Welcome to another episode of The Rabbi and the Therapist. Rabbi, the other day, a friend of mine comes to me and says to me, he's really disturbed. I mean, he knows what I do for a living, right? And he said, I was at my mother's and having dinner, and I made a terrible Freudian slip. You know what a Freudian slip is, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Made a terrible Freudian slip. I said, well, what would you say? He said, well, I meant to say to her, please pass the potatoes. But what came out of my mouth was, you ruined my whole life, you witch.
So that was a Freudian slip.
So that was the Freudian slip, a very, very subtle Freudian slip.
Okay. Now, he's lucky that I was not there at the table.
Why?
Because as a rabbi, I would have to admonish him for what he said.
You would, okay.
And I would have to, yes, I would tell him that definitely it's disrespectful, and he has to keep, that's what one of my teachers always told me. He says, why God created thought and speech. Thought we can keep to ourselves.
Right.
And speech we can't.
Right. However, this was just a joke.
Okay.
Okay. So you don't have to admonish anybody. But I do want to use that as a segue to talk about something which unfortunately is something that I hear very frequently from many people. These are individuals who have family, usually family members, sometimes spouses, who act and speak in an extremely cruel, sadistic way. The term that people used recently, most recently, the most popular term for this is people who were toxic. You'll hear it all over social media. Toxic people, sort of how to deal with it. But it really poses a huge problem. Anecdotally, just yesterday I was talking to a patient who grew up with a terribly cruel mother. The father was out of the picture from the time he was quite young, and a very cruel brother as well. And every time that he would mention something that they would say to him or do to him, his first response was, well, they don't realize that what they said or did was harmful. And after we shoot that down, because the fact of the matter is that you don't need a college degree to know what's kind and what's not kind, he says, well, they must have had a bad day, or they themselves had a problem or some kind of trauma, and that's what explains sort of the abuse excuse, which we challenge also. It's like, why? In other words, I know plenty of people, and frankly, so do you, and unfortunately, we know far too many Holocaust survivors and children of, and just, you go through something terrible, it doesn't justify you turning around and doing something terrible to somebody else. But such is the resistance to people to acknowledge that members of their own family, sometimes their spouses, parents, siblings, children, act and speak in a cruel, destructive, sadistic way. And it puts particularly many religious people, into a lot of conflict because they know they're supposed to honor their parents, if it's in the case of their parents, but just generally this concept of Ahavat Israel, right? To love your fellow Jew. So I really want to hear your views on this, because at the same time, you can't allow someone to get into your life to the extent that they could really be harmful to you and continually hurt you in spiritual ways, emotional ways, and in sometimes material ways. Tell me what you think about that.
So I think we have to look at a few different issues here. The person who's toxic, the person who is speaking in that manner, and I know very clearly, coming from a very large family, an extended family, it's always, you have one uncle or aunt. My parents were always very, very loving. Even when my father was quite strict, he was more the gevura in the family, the strict one in the family. My mother was more chesed, which I think is a very proper and healthy balance.
Okay, so you had a good balance, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, there was that uncle who, if they were coming over, we didn't want to be there. Or likewise for my children. If this particular uncle or aunt or cousin, they didn't want to be there. So the question is, do you tell your kids, okay, just go out and play and you don't have to participate? Do you tell your children, no?
Forget about your children. Why did you keep inviting that uncle to your house? That uncle came over, that uncle was saying things which were insulting to you, which were insulting to your wife, to your family, and your children were watching this man being insulting to you. Why'd you, forget about your kids, why did you invite him over to your house?
Before I get to answer your question,
Yeah.
and it's a very direct question, I'm not sure, I need a little time to think
Good.
of the answer.
Good. I want you to
The
think.
first
It's
thing
not
I
an
want to
easy
say
thing.
to you
Yeah.
is, Jews in general, I think more than others, we are sarcastic, and we will make comments that in a loving way, I tell the people in my family, I tease you because I love you. But you know what? Maybe teasing is not that loving. And I ask myself that question, and of course there's a difference between teasing and teasing. Sometimes, to answer your question, sometimes I don't have a choice not to invite that uncle around. I don't have the
But I'm
choice.
not talking about sarcasm and teasing. We're
Right.
we're going far above that. You know
Correct,
that,
correct.
right?
I'm going back to the question that you asked
Right.
and said, why am I, he's my brother, and it's a family simcha, and I have to invite him, or he's my sister, she's my sister, and I have to invite her. Of course, the question then is, why can't you tell him if he's your brother or sister? My child would say to me, what, if he comes, what does he have to, or when he starts in that tone of voice.
What are you proposing that they're saying? Why don't you open your mouth to them, or?
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the practical thing is, Dad, don't invite that brother if he's going to pick on us on the table. If he's nasty, or you the word that you use, he's toxic, or she's toxic. And if, you say you have to invite them, okay, so the next best thing is, when he starts, tell him to be quiet. Tell him to, tell him to have another rugula, have another cup of coffee, drink something, my friend.
But let's say you've tried that 100 times. You've offered him the rugula 100 times, and he still persists.
Again, I'm not sure, even with wearing the rabbinic hat, I can say that there's an easy and simple answer. Because often that toxic person is a person, like you said before, maybe a parent or someone that I have to give.
Spouse. How many couples have you counseled? Innumerable, right? You have not given me specifics. I am sure that you've counseled couples where one of the spouses was a cruel, sadistic individual who was constantly berating, emotionally, perhaps even physically abusing the other spouse.
Okay, so right here on the Rabbi and the Therapist, I will put the question now to you as a therapist, because one thing I think, again, like sometimes you answer the same way, I can tell you what not to do. I don't think that, let's say, the father is the toxic one, that the mother should say, Dad, Tati is that way, and just ignore him. Or though I'm not sure one parent should gang up with the child against that parent. I don't think that is necessarily as far as the family structure.
Well, take kids out of it. I'm just talking about the couple now. The couple comes into you, and at least in my experience, it could be either the wife or the husband, okay? And they are making, they're making their spouse miserable. They put them in no-win situations. They're hypercritical of them. They're never supportive.
I mean,
unpredictable.
Dr. Bruce, what's the question? When a person does something wrong, they have to be told. When a certain person does something wrong, they have to be told once and sometimes twice and up to 100 times. The Talmud says that you sometimes have to rebuke the other person. Rebuke, of course, has to be done an act of love, but you rebuke, that person has to be rebuked. And therefore, I find when I sit with couples like that, what I really do is point out to them of how destructive it is. I think in the average person, particularly when you're talking about if it's a parent or a loving member of the family, I think they don't realize how destructive that person is. And that is not to say, I'm sorry for interrupting your next thought. That is not to say that, my child is very sensitive. Don't say that in front of the child. We sort of take it on ourselves, I'm very sensitive. No. What you're doing is wrong and should not be done, particularly in any way that we're running this thing.
Okay. Rabbi, I have to push back on this one. First of all, we're going to stick to a couple. Forget the kids for now. Okay? We're going to stick to the couple. Rebuke them 100 times. I'm telling you, there are people who you can rebuke them 1,000 times. I'm going to say to you what I said to my client yesterday, which was, because you just repeated it, it's like, what makes you think that an individual who is acting in such a destructive manner, such an unkind isn't even describing it, in such a cruel way, what makes you think they don't know they're cruel? What makes you think they don't know that they're not doing something wrong? The reason I'm bringing this up, because you asked what the question is that as a therapist, I have to break through what usually is a level of denial that the person that's been abused or being mistreated has built up over time in order to preserve the relationship. But they're telling themselves narratives. One of those narratives is the person just doesn't realize what they're doing. Nonsense. Second thing that they tell themselves is, well, they're doing it because they were in a bad mood or they were abused, or which is ridiculous. In other words, if harm has come to you, the last thing you're going to want to do is to just pass that harm on to someone else. At the same time, I'm sensitive to the fact that, number one, you can't help but love your parent, love your spouse, love your sibling, even if they're being cruel to you. And also, one of the commandments, if it's your parents, you want to honor them, but that goes across the board. I think that in this case, this is just the kind of situation where people need the help of both a mental health professional as well as a rabbi, because there are, I believe, spiritual components to this in order to, on the one hand, do what Hashem would want us to do, but on the other hand, not let people linger in a situation where they're constantly being mistreated.
The Talmud speaks of the concept of visual. If I'm looking at something or seeing something, is it destructive? Now, if a visual thing, me looking at something or being exposed to something, can be destructive, and we know it can be, and then much more so than verbal can be destructive, I think the first thing has to be understood that it's not any less destructive than actually, if a person came into your house and they knocked over the china off your table and they broke the glasses and they broke your chandelier, what would you do? You tell the person, please leave, and if you're not going to leave, I'm calling the cops. I don't believe being verbally abusive, and you want to call it toxic, it's a very, very nice name. It puts a nice label on a situation. I think one of our problems in society, we label things, and
tell me what words you use.
By labeling things, I think we unfortunately give a Hecht to it. Now we have the label, so now we can have the certification that it's
So what word would you use?
Kosher.
What word would you use?
If my brother came over to my house, or if my spouse came to my house, hopefully came to my house, and said, listen, even if it was as loving and close to you as your spouse, and if they're being destructive, being toxic to the children, I think they have to understand.
So their spouse. We're going to stick with that. It's not coming over to your house for dinner. A couple is coming to you, okay, and one of the members of the marriage, over a period of years, since very early in the marriage, is constantly berating, not supporting, insulting, ripping them down.
The scenario that you set up, sometimes I think by the time they get to my office, it's a little too late, for us to re-change everything. But look, what do we teach children who are being bullied in any situation? What we basically say is not acceptable. I cannot listen to this. That's not the way I should be spoken to. That's not the derech eretz that we should have for each other. This is not, notice I threw in each other, because that makes it that both of us are going to give respect towards each other. And that way we deflect from, it's a question of you being toxic. In most cases, And again, I think when you're creating a scenario is probably some type of outside intervention is necessary. Because if I didn't stick up to my spouse, in the 20 years of marriage, or 30 years of marriage, 40 years of marriage, I can't all of a sudden tell the person, okay, you stand up for him and fight back. That's not really going to work. You got to bring in perhaps some type of person, either a Rav, and there's a lot of halacha supportive of the victim in there, or a doctor, and again, there's a lot of supportive
Agreed.
support to
Yeah.
and or some type of a friend, and say, listen, an intervention I think is somewhat necessary. I think you're right. Most of those people don't hear too well. They speak better than their listening qualities, and I think it has to be addressed. Toxic talk is not any less destructive than simply physically breaking things, pushing things, and that way it has to be stopped.
Agreed, 100% agreed. Rabbi, I think historically, this started with Sigmund Freud, who, as you know, was a Jew, right? And I believe you probably have the specifics on this. One of the Rebbes, the Lubavitcher Rebbes, actually consulted with him, and upon leaving his office felt that he sure knows a lot about the animal soul, which I do, which I agree with, but really nothing about the other parts, the other souls that we have. He essentially created this way of thinking where you can essentially, for whatever the behavior, whatever comes out of someone's mouth, you can get to it sort of a deeper, like, where does it come from? I think that set our society off in a very bad place, because everyone assumes, well, if someone does something that's irrational or cruel, well, then there must be a reason for it. And as far as I understand,
Dr. Bruce, you know better than I that much of Dr. Freud's stuff has been debunked. We clearly say that, at one point, he was the Bible, he was the authority, and today in colleges, they don't teach his stuff, and if they do teach his stuff, they criticize it to the extent.
Agreed, but my point is that over time, it seeped into the consciousness of many people. Why would someone try to take an act of cruelty and give it any legitimacy or roots whatsoever? It's an act of nothing. It's an act of the absence of something, not the act of a presence of something.
I agree. I think negative behavior is negative behavior.
True.
If it's thought, if it's speech, or it's action, negative behavior has to stop before we do anything else.
Agreed.
All the curings, the first thing is stop the bleeding, stop the pain, stop the assault. And verbal is as physical. And you stop the assault, and then we can.
But we need to work together more. Certainly, people in my profession can help individuals who are suffering, and really suffering badly, at the hands of others who are mistreating them. But then there's this other side, that they have values, religious values, related to how we need to relate to people that we're related to, family, parents, children, siblings, and also siblings because we've taken vows of marriage, and how we can reconcile the moralities that are dictated through Yiddishkeit with common sense protective mechanisms so that people stop suffering. And with that, I think we would be thrilled if members of the audience that are watching this program, if they have questions or about this topic, because it really does affect quite a few people. Everybody's got an uncle like yours.
So we can say thanks for tuning in to the Rabbi and the Therapist. And in a future episode, we will talk about some of the halachic ramifications to how do you deal with an abusive parent or an abusive sibling. And I think it will be very, very interesting. Join us. Let us know your comments. Let us know your questions. And hopefully we will be here, the Rabbi and the Therapist.